to tell a few quick stories and tell a few quick bills that I think we should all be supporting. So in Spokane right now, the wait list for low-income housing is 3 years. So that means if you do everything right, fill out, qualify, and you're living on the streets of Spokane, that wait list for low-income housing, subsidized housing, is 3 years. So when I say low-income housing, I mean any type of subsidy, whether it's housing that accepts a voucher or housing that uses federal subsidies so that their rents are kept low enough. The University of Washington came out with a study in March, and it showed specifically, not a causation, but a correlation, that they studied 50 different cities across the United States. Poverty doesn't correlate to homelessness.
Correct.
Housing does. Only housing, cities with high rents have higher rates of homelessness. Detroit, which has really high poverty rates, but really low rents, has low rates of homelessness. Housing is directly correlated to homelessness. And it's the first, they wrote a book on it, it's great, it's called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And there's two, it's a data analyst from the Tacoma Tribune and an associate professor from the University of Washington. It's a great read to ground yourself in why we're in the position we are. So why are we in the position we are? And I think it's really important to understand that in the 1970s, we cut 75% of the subsidy from low-income housing at the federal level that went down to localities to build low-income housing. We've never made that up. In Spokane in particular in 1974, we love to talk about the success of Expo. But when they tore down the train station and all the buildings near the train station, we lost over 30% of our low-income housing in downtown Spokane because of Expo. And we had no plans to replace them, and we've never replaced them. In the late 2000s, we lost buildings like the Otis that were single rental SROs, and we never replaced those, nor had a plan to replace those. So we've got a fundamental problem where you're waiting 3 years for low-income housing. Maslow's hierarchy shows that if you don't meet your basic needs, you can't meet your higher needs. You need a roof over your head in order to do anything else. You need free school lunches for everybody, like somebody mentioned earlier, but you also need a roof over your head. If you're not able to meet your basic needs, you cannot meet any of your other higher needs. If your basic needs are not being met, and you can't meet your higher needs, that's where I think we need to fundamentally think as a society and all become social democrats. I'm not saying I'm a socialist, but I'm a socialist, democratic socialist. There's certain things that society should fundamentally guarantee, because if we don't, it screws everything else up. And you're seeing that right now across the West Coast. In 2018, I had an opportunity to go with a bunch of people from the city and the community to go study environmentalism in Copenhagen. The first night in town, we're in Copenhagen, in downtown. Copenhagen is exactly the same size as Seattle. And we're walking around after this nice schmoozy dinner they gave us, and I didn't see any homeless people. So I'm like, what is going on? And I literally said, what is going on? This is a town the size of Seattle. And so I spent every night, I get really bad jet lag, so I'm up all night, up till 3 in the morning. And I started wandering. We'd go out to these dinners, and I'd spend 2 or 3 hours every night. I was looking on the internet. We're the worst places in the poorest neighborhoods in Copenhagen. And I'm like, they gave us a bike, an electric bike for the trip. So I'm out on my bike at 2 a.m. looking for homeless people. I found in 8 nights, I found 5 homeless people. 4 of the 5 had a social worker with them trying to get them into housing. Copenhagen, in their housing stock, 18% of the housing stock in Copenhagen is subsidized. In Spokane, we're at less than 4% of our housing stock is subsidized. Unless we increase that percentage, we're gonna have people struggling using over 50% of their income in order to afford to live in market rate apartments. Unless we fix our zoning laws, like Houston, Texas has decreased massively using rapid rehousing dollars in market rate by rehousing people in market rate housing. But why is their housing affordable and you can actually afford to live in market rate housing in Houston, Texas? Because they don't have any zoning. They don't have single-family zoning and multifamily zoning. I was at the mayor's house, the ex-mayor's house in Houston, and she was pointing out her backyard in this historic neighborhood in her beautiful old, it looked like with big towers on it, and she had a triplex right in her backyard. And they don't have zoning, but they also don't have housing problems. We need to fundamentally understand why we created zoning. How am I doing on time? 5? Okay, so that's a grounding. There are 4 bills. Right now, all of the housing money at the state level comes out of the general fund. So that means depending on how the state's economics work is how we fund housing. So in bad economic years, the housing trust fund, where all of that money sits, is really low. In good economic years, they put money into the housing trust fund, and like last session, you have a record amount of $400 plus million. The Affordable Homes Act, which has not been dropped, but is being sponsored by Representative Chop. He's the former 18-year Speaker of the House, and this is gonna have legs, but this is great because he increases REIT, which is a real estate excise tax at a state level on multi-million-dollar homes, puts a 5% charge on those sales of those multi-million-dollar homes, and creates a permanent funding source for $500 million for low-income housing, so that it doesn't depend on who's in the legislature, and it doesn't depend on how the economy is doing. It's permanent money for low-income housing. And that bill has to pass if we want any stability in our housing system. If you're a housing developer, you're having to look 2 or 3 years ahead as you're buying the land, as you're speculating on land, and knowing that there's gonna be money in the legislature for those dollars. So we really need to be supporting that. The governor's budget, which brings to the people, and this was mentioned earlier, that will bring a $4 billion package to a vote of the people, is really important because we need to front load our housing with money now, and the bonding is the way that we can do that as a community. The middle housing, which is what I'm talking about when I say Houston has no zoning, single-family zoning was created in Berkeley, California in 1916. Single-family zoning is specifically because they didn't allow Berkeley to zone based on race. They didn't want a black business to open. And so they passed a zoning clause that said we won't allow black businesses. The California State Supreme Court said, no, that's racist. So what they do, they turned around and within a month invented single-family zoning, knowing that only the white people had the wealth, and created single-family zoning in order to concentrate the rich people in one neighborhood and the poor people in all neighborhoods. But we know for a fact that mixed income neighborhoods are how we all accept each other when you go to the grocery store and see all income levels. So we need to destroy the zoning mechanisms so that we have more places to build low-income housing, so that all neighborhoods and all of our communities have mixed incomes, and that we can stop creating others in our community. And then finally, the last bill is the transit. It's the Sound Communities is running a bill, and this would take mass transit stops. So think of the Central City line in Spokane, and there's those transit stops. It would create a pot of money to buy up the land around those transit stops so that predatory capitalism doesn't come in and buy and create a bunch of condos. It would create a pot of money to go buy the land around transit stops and then set aside 25% of that land for subsidized low-income housing. And that's going to be really important as we build out transit in Spokane. And with that, those are the bills I think are really important in the grounding and